Now, why did our ancestors believe that the earth was flat and that the sun was moving? Not moving. Sun was static. Earth was, sort of, sun was moving or not?
Yes.
From rising in the east and then going to the south. So there's a movement of sun also. So why did they believe like that?
Based on whatever they are seeing.
What they can see in real life.
They can see.
No, she was saying something.
Lack of knowledge among the people, and also the people can't go outside of the world and see the earth size
From
or
above.
the shape from outside.
Yeah. So that belief continued for years. And I remember the tragic plight of Bruno, who was burned alive for saying that earth was, round. And even in the time of Aristotle, that belief system continued for thousands of years. Now, what about our belief about learning a language? What is the popular belief about human child learning mother tongue? What do people believe about learning language?
Through imitation and repetition.
Through imitation. So, imitating whom?
Imitating the mothers or the
All right.
people around them.
Yeah. So, this is a very strong belief. The child learns a language through imitation, okay, and also through repetition, repeating the same thing again and again. And in those days, it was believed that the mind is like an empty slate. A very serious question is there. Does the newborn child know anything about language? Now probably we know, but most people do not know that. Okay? So they believe that everything regarding language comes from outside. It's so in the case of mother tongue, and it is naturally so in the case of English also, because there is no speech community around. There is no one to imitate also. So through imitation and repetition, if mother tongue is learned, you have to provide the same situation in the classroom for imitating and repeating the same thing. And precisely that has been happening in the classrooms also, how children are doing that. So there are certain belief systems promoted by a certain school of thought. Today we call them the behaviorist schools kind of thing. Let's see what these assumptions are. I'll just, you can look at the screen. The child's mind is like an empty slate, which is tabula rasa, which gets filled with experience from the speech community. Language is a behavioral manifestation which can be counted in terms of stimulus and response. Now we are just talking about the belief systems promoted by the behavioral schools. Language is a baggage of language elements like sounds, letters or structures, functions, idioms, usages, etc. Language is a skill subject as against subjects like physics or chemistry, which are known as content subjects. Okay? And language, a skill subject, means it is manifested through the skills like listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We are very familiar with that. LSRW. Now, if the students make some errors, these errors are to be corrected as and when they are made, otherwise they will be negatively reinforced. And once it is negatively reinforced, it will be difficult to get rid of these errors. So these are the popular beliefs, and these beliefs were strengthened by behavioral school of psychology. Not only that, there was a kind of philosophy called empiricism. You can see the name of John Locke behind that, who says that the mind is a tabula rasa. Okay. So in fact, there are three schools of thought which converged now. On the one hand, there was a behaviorist school, and then the empiricists, and also the structuralists, who explain the structure of sentence. So these things had a very strong influence on designing the curriculum, designing the textbooks, and deciding the methodology for teaching language. And if you remember, in your school days, probably you were studying something called graded series of textbooks. The idea is that some structures and vocabulary items are introduced in lower classes. The higher you go up, there will be more number of structures and more number of vocabulary items. And these things are put into the lesson, and there are questions on that, questions related to vocabulary, grammar, everything. And ultimately it is believed that by learning these elements of language like structures or usages or idioms, the learners will be able to use language. This was the way how these schools of thought, behaviorism and empiricism and structuralism, influenced the whole course of language teaching. Now, this situation changed when in 1957 Noam Chomsky came out with a claim on human languages, saying that the language is a genetic endowment for human beings. It's not that language is coming from outside, but every child is equipped with a language device. In early days it was named as language acquisition device. Today we call it the universal grammar. It's not the grammar of any particular language, but possibly the grammar of all possible human languages. Okay. Now let's try to understand some of the claims in this innateness theory of Chomsky. You can listen to a talk by Chomsky.
We want to look at language as a normal biological system, some module of the organism. Then the standard questions for any module arise at once, roughly speaking, what, how, and why questions. What are the properties of the acquired system, each one regarded as an internal system of an individual? How are these properties acquired, and why do they have these properties and not some other properties? Well, perhaps the most elementary property of human language is that it consists of a discrete infinity of interpretable expressions. So there's 5-word sentences, and 6-word sentences, and no 5.5-word sentence that goes on indefinitely like the integers. Now that's kind of unusual. There's nothing like that known in the biological world. So that's one isolated property, maybe down to the level of DNA. What it means is that each speaker, each child, has somehow internalized a computational process, what's called a generative process, that yields an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions.
So the core of the innateness theory of Chomsky is that human beings are born with language, which today we call universal grammar. It's also known as the principles and parameters.
Well, for language, we can analyze the genetic endowment into a component specific to human language. Standard term for that is universal grammar, UG, and other components of the genetic endowment that somehow are relevant to language development, so other cognitive systems, neurophysiological structures, and so on.
Now, what do you mean by principles and parameters? You know that all languages have something common, and whatever are the common properties of languages we can put under principles, and those properties which are language specific, you can call them as parameters. Okay. Now, to understand this concept, let us try to know what we mean by parameters. Now, how do you say the idea, John ate a mango in your language? John ate a mango. In your language, how will you say? What's the language? How will you say it?
John aam khaya.
John aam khaya hai. How will you say it in your language?
John aam toa.
Okay, John mango ate.
Yes.
Okay.
John மாம்பழத்தை தின்றான். John amba khado.
So look at all these languages. One is Tamil, the one is and your language is Hindi. In all these languages, you can see that you have the object first. Let's say the complement of the verb comes first, and comes the verb. John mango ate. But in English, you have in order. You get the verb first, and then the object. So look at the structure, ate a mango, we call it the verb phrase, and the verb phrase, the verb is the head. So there are languages where the head comes initially and the complement appears after that. And there are Indian languages where the head appears at the end of the structure. So let us say this is one of the parametric differences, and this is captured in the universal grammar. The newborn child, in that universal grammar, this parametric value will not be set. So the newborn child has two options, either to choose for the head initial option or the head final option. And based on the minimal or the optimal input the child gets, the value of this parameter is set in one way or the other. And there are other parameters also, which are related to universal grammar. And language learning from this point of view means setting the value of each of these parameters. It has nothing to do with learning grammar or practicing idioms, nothing of that kind. So when the child gets the the meaningful input, it could be optimal input, not the quantity of input, but the quality of the input that the child gets, the value of each parameters are set. So in the case of mother tongue, it is happening, and you have already set values for the grammar in your inbuilt grammar. Now in the case of second language, these parametric values are to be reset. So in learning English, it's a question of resetting the parametric values. Now it cannot be taught. Now these things cannot be taught. Universal grammar cannot be taught. Now please don't confuse universal grammar with the grammar that is appearing in the grammar books. Later we will also see what is the problem with those grammar books also. So this is a concept. Now Chomsky has put forward a number of arguments to show that behaviorist theories on language does not work. Okay? Now one classic argument is what he calls the poverty of stimulus argument. It simply means that the stimulus is very, very impoverished, whereas the response is enormous. Now examine the kind of language input that child gets. Most families are now living like nuclear families. So the input that child gets is very minimal or rather optimal kind of thing. Nobody talks to a child always using continuous sentences and full sentences, full-fledged sentences. It is broken utterances, sometimes fragments. So whether it is whether broken or not, at the age of 2 the child starts producing language. The child can talk about almost anything. Okay, talk about his desire, likes, dislikes, anything. So if you look at the stimulus response argument, here the stimulus is very impoverished, whereas the response is enormous. So how do you account for that? Unless there is something called innateness, this language could not have been produced by the human children. And also another problem is that the psychologists like Pavlov or Skinner or Thorndike, they had experimented on animal behavior. Okay? And animal behavior is rather predictable. Now how can we extend a theory that works on predictable behavior to a species whose behavior is totally unpredictable? And there are other reasons also why the behavioral claims on language does not hold. And also from neurobiology you have further evidence. Now there are 2 areas in the left hemisphere which are called Broca's area, named after the scientist, and also Wernicke's area, which are related to language reception and also production. Okay, so the linguistic information is encoded in the human brain in the form of synaptic connections, and this information is located in the left hemisphere in 2 small clusters of neurons called Broca's area and also Wernicke's area. And there are researchers, for example Jane Atchison, who said language behavior is a biologically triggered behavior like walking or sexual behavior. Now, let us try to understand what we mean by a biologically triggered of behavior. It's not just a behavioral change. Now, remember, the behavioral psychologists were claiming that language learning is a verbal behavior. Now, the modification here is it's not just a behavior, but a biologically triggered behavior. It simply means that there are certain milestones for that. How does the human child start walking? The newborn child just cannot stand on the two legs and start walking. So what are the milestones for walking? It has to turn on one side, lie on its belly, crawl, sit holding on something, stand up. No human child can skip these stages, and no enthusiastic mother can put the child on two legs and start teaching how to walk. It's not possible. Mothers are more sensible than teachers. They don't do that. Like the language also, there are certain milestones. For example, crying is one of the milestones of language. Maybe the newborn child cries, then it produces some sort of babbling is there, produces some sounds. At the age of 1, it produces some one-word utterances. At the age of 2, it produces two-word utterances. Let us have a look at the different milestones of language. You can look at the screen. Now, crying happens at birth, cooing 6 weeks, babbling 6 months, intonation patterns 8 months, one-word utterances 1 year, two-word utterances 18 months, and word inflections 2 years, questions, negatives, when 2 years and 3 months, rare or complex constructions 5 years, and mature speech in 10 years. These are milestones. And the properties of a biologically triggered behavior also is something very noteworthy. Let's see what these are. Now, just think about language. Newborn child, is language absolutely necessary for the human child to survive? We can't say no, we can't be. It's a possibility, may or may not be. But even if there is no absolute need for language, the child produces language. The child doesn't have to ask for food. Mother knows and mother feeds the child. Okay? So there is no need for the child to use language. In spite of that, language develops. Okay. Now again, recall how we learned mother tongue. Was it the result of a conscious decision on our part? No. Did you decide, okay, tomorrow onwards I am going to speak mother tongue? It doesn't happen, Maybe in practicing a skill, you can have a decision like that. So you can practice on how to throw a javelin and hit a target. You can practice it. Now, cycling is a skill that you can improve through practicing. Swimming is a skill that you can improve through practicing. So, are language skills are something that can be improved through practicing? This is a question. If so, which of these skills can be improved through practicing? Just like swimming, just like cycling. Now, when you talk about LSRW, the implication is that if you practice these skills, language will be learned. Does it really happen so? Now, take a case of a class 5 child. You write an English passage, teaches the child how to articulate every word, using all voice modulation, everything, all these articulated features, and make the child produce it. That child can probably reproduce the text exactly the way you want it to do. But can you claim that child has learned that language? So the question is, does practicing directly lead to learning language? Do you practice mother tongue? No. If you don't practice mother tongue, why should you practice English? What do you mean by practice?
Put to use.
Put to use. Putting use is not practicing. The common understanding about practicing is that you do repeatedly the same thing again and again till you master it. Just like cycling, a skill, you can keep on doing it, and that is the implication of practicing. But language is not acquired in that way. It's not that way. and probably you land up with learning some words or sentences or some total passages. That's all.
Being in the language environment may be developing, like it may develop the language.
Of course, an environment is needed, you know. So this is one of the arguments. Now, for example, when Chomsky came out with the language innateness theory, people were asking the question: okay, if the newborn child has already a language, you know, inbuilt language, why doesn't the human child start speaking language the moment it is born? Now, this question appears to be a very, very reasonable question. Okay, at the same time, you can ask a number of counter questions also. Now, the newborn child has all the systems intact. It has a physical system, it's a biological system like a respiratory system, skeletal system, tissue system, everything is intact. Then why doesn't the newborn child start walking the moment it's born? Needs a kind of maturation. That's why we call it a biologically triggered behavior. At the age of 2, every human child starts speaking a language, but the environment is very crucial. But not to the extent that, you know, everything regarding language is coming from the environment. So the ultimate question is whether language is a social construct or an individual construct. If you look for the Marxian theories, we say language is a social construct. No single human being can construct a language. Okay. At the same time, only human beings can produce language. Even if you train a gorilla or a chimpanzee for weeks and years together, there is no recorded evidence that it can learn any language. So it is something very species specific. Only the human species has the ability to produce language. Okay. And another thing is that, you know, okay, you had to wait for the inner system to start working, you know. Certain maturity is to be occurred by the human brain kind of thing. Before that, certain things cannot be occurred, you know. So acquisition is a biologically triggered process that way. Certain relevant synaptic connections are to be formed in the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. Then only it comes out as language. And again, we are talking about what is the relevance of, you know, the nature outside. Now, take the case of puberty. You know, we know that human beings attain puberty line at a certain age, and we believe that it's a biologically decided phenomenon. Now, what is the role of nurturing in that? Suppose the child does not get proper nourishment, if it is undernourished, either it can be delayed or it can also not happen. Both possibilities are there. So, the environment also is very crucial. Okay. But what you get from the environment, it's a very optimal kind of thing that the child is received from the environment. So that's why people like Steven Pinker say it's not the quantity of input which matters, but the quality of input the child gets. Now, how do you translate all this into classroom, transaction? That's another question. But these are theoretical, findings which have a lot of pedagogical implication. So let us talk about what was the effect of Chomskyan theory on the claims on language and language learning. I'll just look at the screen. Yeah, first look at the claims on language as a biologically triggered behavior. Property number 1, the behavior emerges before it is necessary. As we said, the child gets food even though it doesn't ask for food. Its appearance is not the result of a conscious decision. Its emergence is not triggered by external events. Direct teaching and intensive practice have relatively very little effect. Mothers probably do not teach anything. I don't know, there could be mothers who try to teach also. There is a regular sequence of milestones as the behavior develops. We already said what the milestones are. And there may be a critical period for the acquisition of language. But this point has been debated later, because there is something called brain plasticity, so even adults can acquire language. Some time earlier it was thought that 12 years is the critical period, So after that, the ability to acquire language diminishes, But that assumption has been questioned later on. So today we talk about the brain plasticity, which means that at any stage the acquisition process can happen, kind of thing. So the convergence of theoretical linguistics and then experiential pedagogy and neurobiology, cognitive psychology has derived new insights into language pedagogy. So we have a few assumptions regarding language and also language pedagogy. Look at the screen. Language is man's biological system which gets unfolded. Okay? Language acquisition is a non-conscious process. Simply means nobody takes a deliberate decision, okay, tomorrow onwards I am going to speak a language. It just happens. Psychologists call it subconscious process, but I am using layman's terminology, non-conscious process. Language is acquired not through learning and practicing isolated language facts such as words, structures, but through clusters of linguistic expressions involved in the reception and production of discourses. I think we had a discussion on what we mean by discourses. Any unit larger than the sentence, like conversation, description, narrative, poem, song, drama script, everything which you find in print media like newspaper or magazines or in the visual media. These are the things. The discrete units of language like words and structures cannot exist. Right. Language is not the totality of the 4 skills, that is LSRW, but the inner competence manifest in the performance of these skills. The implication is that if you focus on these skills, the knowledge of language may not be available. But if you have innate knowledge of language, or if you have knowledge of language, or if you have acquired the knowledge of language, these skills will be manifested. So it's not a two-way process. By practicing skills, you cannot have knowledge of language. But if you have knowledge of language, these skills will be manifested. Okay. Now, language acquisition can take place only in a collaborative environment, where the child gets ample opportunities to get involved in interpersonal and intrapersonal communication. It's obvious, no human being can singly create a language. A language is acquired not through repetition, but through reoccurrence of certain things. It's not repetition. Now we'll understand this terminology in a later lesson. Okay. Now language acquisition is facilitated not by learning linguistic facts such as vocabulary or grammar, but through the clustering of these facts in meaningful discourses. So these are the theoretical assumptions for developing the new pedagogy on English language. So in the coming lessons, we'll have a closer look at what this new pedagogy is. Recall some of the points that we discussed. Anything that comes to your mind, regarding language.
Language is a biologically triggered process.
Yeah, it's a biologically triggered off process. Okay. Right. Behavior. Biologically triggered off behavior. Anything else? What Chomsky said.
Language could be learned by a recurrence of certain things, not by repetition.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what exactly is language? Is something that comes from outside or something that is innate? This is a question. So that's the fundamental point you have to remember. The language module is very much intact in human beings, and what we get from outside is very, very minimal or optimal.
So we talked about poverty of stimulus argument, where we said the input is a lot lesser, but then with little input, enormous language can be produced by the child.
Is produced, not can be produced. Is produced. That is how it's happening, and also the process.
And language is not a conscious.
Language learning.
Language learning.
Learning is not a conscious process. Okay. So what normally happens in English classroom is it conscious or non-conscious kind of thing?
Conscious.
Very consciously. The child is conscious, the teacher is conscious that you are teaching and learning English. So how do you get rid of these things?
And we also said language is more collaborative than
it's a collaborative environment. I think those are some of the main points. Thank you.